The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his military dress uniform one final time. The metal on his chest caught the light, its silver surface gleaming against the dark fabric. He had worn this uniform to countless ceremonies, but today felt different. Today, he was not here as a decorated soldier, but as a defendant in a case that would change everything. Thomas had served as a royal guard for over 2 decades, standing silently at attention during state ceremonies, protecting dignitaries and maintaining the honor of his position. His record was spotless, his dedication unwavering. The medal he wore today was not just decoration. It represented years of faithful service, sacrifices made, and a life devoted to duty above self. The trouble began 3 months earlier when Thomas witnessed something he was never supposed to see. During a routine security check at the palace, he discovered documents that revealed corruption at the highest levels of government. Important contracts were being awarded to friends and family members, while proper procedures were ignored. Money meant for public services was disappearing into private accounts. Thomas faced an impossible choice. His oath as a royal guard demanded loyalty and silence, but his conscience as a citizen demanded action. For weeks he struggled with the decision, knowing that speaking out would likely end his career and possibly land him in legal trouble. The weight of the secret pressed down on him like a physical burden. Finally, Thomas made his choice. He carefully copied the documents and delivered them to a trusted journalist who had a reputation for investigating government corruption. The story broke like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through the political establishment. Within days, several high-ranking officials resigned and investigations were launched. However, Thomas's role in exposing the corruption did not remain secret for long. Government investigators traced the leaked documents back to him through security camera footage and access logs. Instead of being praised as a whistleblower, he was charged with theft of government documents, breach of his security oath, and violation of the Official Secrets Act. The charges were serious, carrying potential prison sentences that could destroy not only his career but his entire future. Thomas hired a lawyer with his savings, but the case seemed hopeless. The prosecution had clear evidence of his actions, and the law appeared to be on their side, regardless of his noble intentions. As Thomas walked into the courthouse that morning, reporters surrounded him, shouting questions about his motivations and whether he regretted his actions. He kept his head high and his expression calm, just as he had been trained to do during his years of service. The metal on his chest felt heavier with each step, a reminder of everything he was about to lose. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and government officials who had come to witness the downfall of the guard who dared to speak truth to power. Thomas took his seat at the defendant's table, acutely aware of the hostile stares directed his way. His lawyer, a young woman named Sarah Chen, leaned over to whisper words of encouragement, but they both knew the odds were stacked against them. Judge Harold Morrison entered the courtroom with the authority and gravitas that came with 30 years on the bench. He was known for his strict interpretation of the law and his no-nonsense approach to judicial proceedings. The prosecution was confident that Judge Morrison would see this case exactly as they did, a clear violation of the law that demanded punishment, regardless of the defendant's stated motivations. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man named Richard Hawthorne, rose to present the government's case. He painted Thomas as a traitor who had violated sacred oaths and endangered national security for personal gain. He argued that allowing such behavior to go unpunished would encourage other government employees to take the law into their own hands. Thomas listened to the accusations with the same stoic expression he had maintained during countless hours of guard duty. Inside, however, his heart was racing. Everything he had worked for, everything he believed in, was being twisted into something ugly and selfish. The prosecution made it sound as if he had acted out of greed or spite, rather than a genuine desire to serve the public good. When it came time for the defense to present their case, Sarah Chen stood up with determination in her eyes. She knew they were fighting an uphill battle, but she believed in her client's innocence and the righteousness of his cause. She began to tell Thomas his story, not just the story of what he had done, but who he really was. Sarah Chen's voice rang clear through the courtroom as she began to reveal the true character of the man sitting at the defendant's table. She spoke of Thomas Mitchell's early life, growing up in a working-class family where integrity was valued above material success. His father had been a factory worker who never missed a day of work in 40 years, and his mother had volunteered at the local food bank every weekend. Thomas had enlisted in the military straight out of high school, not because he lacked other options, but because he felt called to serve something greater than himself. During his basic training, his instructors noted his exceptional discipline and moral character. He was the kind of soldier who would help struggling recruits improve, rather than mock their weaknesses. His military service took him to several overseas deployments where he served with distinction. In Afghanistan, Thomas had risked his own life to save 3 wounded comrades during an ambush, carrying them to safety one by one while under enemy fire. For this act of heroism, he received the Medal of Valor that now adorned his uniform, the same medal that seemed to shine brighter as Sarah told his story. When Thomas returned from overseas, he was selected for the elite Royal Guard unit, a position that required not only exceptional military skills but also unquestionable character. The vetting process was rigorous, involving extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, and interviews with everyone who had ever known him. Out of hundreds of applicants, Thomas was among the chosen few. As a Royal Guard, Thomas had protected heads of state, foreign dignitaries, and members of the royal family during countless public events. He had stood motionless for hours in scorching heat and freezing cold, never once abandoning his post. His superiors praised his reliability and professionalism. Fellow guards respected him as a natural leader, who always looked out for the welfare of his teammates. Sarah Chen then turned to address the events that led to Thomas's current predicament. She emphasized that when he discovered the corruption documents, his first instinct was not to profit from them or use them for personal gain. Instead, he spent sleepless nights wrestling with his conscience, understanding fully the potential consequences of his actions. The defense attorney revealed that Thomas had actually attempted to report the corruption through official channels first. He had approached his immediate supervisor, only to be told that such matters were above his pay grade and that he should forget what he had seen. When he persisted, he was warned that continued inquiry could result in his dismissal from the guard unit. Undeterred by these warnings, Thomas had then tried to report the matter to the Internal Affairs Division of the government. His complaint was filed but seemed to disappear into a bureaucratic black hole. Weeks passed without any acknowledgement or investigation. It became clear that the corruption reached so high that official channels were either compromised or unwilling to act. Only, after exhausting all proper procedures, did Thomas make the difficult decision to go public with the information. Even then, he was careful to redact any details that might compromise national security or endanger individuals. He focused solely on the financial irregularities and contract manipulation that were costing taxpayers millions of dollars. Sarah Chen's presentation was having a visible effect on the courtroom. Several jurors leaned forward, clearly engaged by this new perspective on the defendant. Even some of the government officials present seemed uncomfortable as the true scope of Thomas's character became apparent. The man they had painted as a traitor was revealed to be someone who had consistently put duty and honor above personal interest. Judge Morrison observed these proceedings with growing interest. As a veteran himself, he understood the weight of military oaths and the difficulty of the choice Thomas had faced. The prosecutor, Richard Hawthorne, began to look increasingly uncomfortable as his simple narrative of betrayal became complicated by the reality of Thomas's exemplary record and noble motivations. The defense attorney called several character witnesses to testify on Thomas's behalf. His former commanding officer spoke of his exceptional leadership and moral courage. A fellow guard described how Thomas had once talked him out of suicide during a personal crisis. A military chaplain testified that Thomas regularly volunteered his time to counsel young soldiers struggling with the transition to civilian life. Perhaps most powerfully, Sarah Chen called Thomas's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Watson, to the stand. The 78-year-old woman described how Thomas had been caring for her since her husband's death, grocery shopping, maintaining her yard, and checking on her daily. She spoke with tears in her eyes about how he had refused any payment for his help, saying that taking care of neighbors was simply what decent people did. As the character testimony concluded, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The man sitting at the defendant's table was no longer seen as a calculating traitor, but as someone who had consistently demonstrated the highest moral standards throughout his life. The prosecution's case, while legally sound, began to feel hollow in the face of such overwhelming evidence of Thomas's character. Judge Morrison called for a brief recess, during which Thomas remained seated, maintaining his military bearing despite the emotional weight of hearing his life's work described in such detail. The medal on his chest seemed to glow with renewed significance, no longer just a piece of metal but a symbol of a life lived in service to others. When court resumed after the recess, the atmosphere had noticeably shifted. Judge Morrison's expression appeared more thoughtful, and several jurors were looking at Thomas with what seemed like newfound respect rather than suspicion. The prosecution, however, was not ready to concede defeat. Richard Hawthorne rose for his cross-examination with determination to restore his narrative. Hawthorne began aggressively questioning Thomas about his oath of loyalty to the Crown and his sworn duty to maintain confidentiality. He pointed out that regardless of Thomas's personal character, he had still violated specific laws that existed for important reasons. The prosecutor argued that allowing personal conscience to override legal obligations would lead to chaos in government institutions. "Did you or did you not take an oath to protect state secrets?" Hawthorne demanded, his voice echoing through the courtroom. Thomas answered clearly and honestly that he had indeed taken such an oath. When pressed about whether he understood the legal consequences of breaking that oath, Thomas confirmed that he had been fully aware of the potential penalties. The prosecutor then attempted to suggest that Thomas could have found other ways to address his concerns without breaking the law. He questioned why Thomas hadn't tried harder to work within the system, or why he hadn't sought legal counsel before taking action. These questions were designed to make Thomas appear reckless and impulsive rather than thoughtful and principled. However, Thomas's responses remained calm and measured. He explained in detail his attempts to work through proper channels and the months of agonizing deliberation before he finally acted. His sincerity was evident to everyone present, and the prosecutor's aggressive tactics began to backfire, making Hawthorne appear to be bullying a genuinely decent man. Sarah Chen's redirect examination allowed Thomas to explain his motivations more fully. He spoke about seeing the corruption documents and realizing that millions of dollars meant for public services like schools and hospitals were being diverted to private accounts. He described thinking about the families who would suffer because of this theft and feeling that his oath to protect the public ultimately outweighed his oath to maintain silence. The most powerful moment came when Sarah Chen asked Thomas if he regretted his actions. He paused for a long moment, looking directly at Judge Morrison, then spoke with quiet conviction. "Your Honor, I regret that I was put in a position where I had to choose between two important duties. But I cannot regret trying to protect the people I swore to serve, even if it meant sacrificing my career and freedom." The prosecution's case continued with technical experts and legal scholars who testified about the importance of maintaining government secrecy and the potential dangers of allowing individual judgment to override institutional rules. Their arguments were logical and well-reasoned, but they seemed abstract compared to the very human story of Thomas's struggle with conscience. As the trial progressed, media coverage began to shift in Thomas's favor. Initially, many outlets had portrayed him as a traitor, or at best a misguided idealist. But as details of his character and motivations emerged, public opinion started to change. Veterans organizations began to express support for him, and editorials appeared questioning whether the government was right to prosecute someone for exposing genuine corruption. Judge Morrison observed these developments with careful attention to maintaining proper judicial neutrality. However, those who knew him well could see that he was deeply affected by the case. The judge had served in the military himself during the Vietnam War and understood the weight of conflicting loyalties and impossible choices. During a particularly tense moment in the proceedings, an unexpected development occurred. A court clerk handed Judge Morrison an urgent message, causing him to call for another recess. The message contained information that would prove crucial to understanding the true scope of what Thomas had uncovered and the courage it had taken for him to come forward. The investigation triggered by Thomas's leaked documents had uncovered far more corruption than initially realized. Government auditors had found evidence of a systematic scheme that had diverted nearly $50 million from public programs over several years. The money had been used to fund luxury lifestyles for corrupt officials, while essential services suffered from underfunding. More importantly, investigators had discovered that several people who had previously tried to report aspects of this corruption had been transferred to remote assignments, demoted, or mysteriously faced career-ending disciplinary actions. Thomas had not been the first to notice the irregularities, but he had been the first to successfully bring them to public attention because of his position and access to comprehensive documentation. When court reconvened, this new information cast Thomas's actions in an entirely different light. He had not simply violated his oath on a whim or for personal gain. He had risked everything to expose a criminal conspiracy that was stealing from the public treasury on a massive scale. His actions had led to the recovery of millions of dollars and the prosecution of several corrupt officials. Judge Morrison's demeanor became increasingly serious as these revelations emerged. The choice facing him was no longer simply about whether to punish someone for breaking rules, but about how to balance the competing demands of legal order and moral justice. The case was becoming a test of whether the legal system could recognize and protect genuine heroism, even when it came at the cost of technical rule-breaking. The courtroom tension was palpable as both sides prepared for closing arguments. Everyone present understood that this case would set an important precedent about the rights and responsibilities of government employees who discover wrongdoing. The decision would echo far beyond Thomas's individual fate. The closing arguments began with prosecutor Richard Hawthorne making one final attempt to convince the court that Thomas's actions, however well-intentioned, could not be excused. He stood before the jury with the confidence of someone who believed the law was clearly on his side. Regardless of the moral complexities that had emerged during the trial, Hawthorne argued that governments must be able to trust their employees to maintain confidentiality, even when they disagree with what they discover. He painted a picture of chaos that would result if every government worker felt free to decide for themselves what information should be public. Laws exist for good reasons, he declared, and we cannot allow individual conscience to override legal obligations, no matter how pure the motives might be. The prosecutor reminded the jury that Thomas had alternatives available to him, including resignation from his position, if he could not in good conscience continue to serve. He suggested that Thomas could have found other ways to address his concerns without breaking his sworn oath and violating federal laws that carried serious penalties. However, even as Hawthorne spoke, it was clear that the revelations about the extent of the corruption had undermined his position. The jury appeared uncomfortable with the idea of punishing someone whose actions had exposed criminal activity and saved taxpayers millions of dollars. Several jurors kept glancing at Thomas, who maintained his dignified bearing throughout the prosecution's attack. When Sarah Chen rose for the defense's closing argument, the courtroom fell completely silent. She had carefully prepared for this moment, knowing that Thomas's fate might depend on her ability to articulate why his actions represented the highest form of patriotism rather than a betrayal of his country. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "we are here today not because Thomas Mitchell broke the law, but because he refused to break faith with the people he served." She reminded them of his exemplary record, his courage under fire, and his consistent pattern of putting others before himself throughout his life. Sarah Chen then addressed the prosecution's argument about the necessity of following rules. She pointed out that the very officials who were demanding strict adherence to secrecy laws were the same ones who had been systematically breaking laws against theft and corruption. "They ask us to punish the man who exposed their crimes while they themselves have stolen millions from the public treasury." The defense attorney's most powerful argument focused on the concept of moral courage. She described how easy it would have been for Thomas to simply ignore what he had discovered and continue drawing his salary while innocent people suffered from the theft of public resources. Instead, he had chosen the difficult path of conscience, knowing it would likely cost him everything he had worked for. Sarah Chen also addressed the prosecution's claim that Thomas could have simply resigned if he disagreed with what he discovered. "Resignation would have been the easy way out," she said, "but resignation would have left the corruption in place, allowing it to continue stealing from schools, hospitals, and other vital services." Thomas Mitchell chose the harder path because he understood that sometimes protecting the public requires personal sacrifice. As the closing arguments concluded, Judge Morrison faced one of the most difficult decisions of his judicial career. The law seemed clear on the surface. Thomas had violated his oath and broken federal statutes. But the deeper truth was equally clear. His actions had been motivated by the highest principles and had resulted in enormous public benefit. The judge called for a brief recess before delivering his verdict, during which the courtroom buzzed with speculation about the outcome. Thomas sat quietly, accepting that his fate was now beyond his control. The medal on his chest caught the afternoon light streaming through the courtroom windows, a reminder of all the times he had put duty before personal comfort. When Judge Morrison returned to the bench, his expression was grave but determined. He had clearly wrestled with the competing demands of legal precedent and moral justice. The packed courtroom held its collective breath as he began to speak, knowing that his words would define not only Thomas's future, but also the broader question of how society should treat those who risk everything to expose wrongdoing. This case has forced me to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between law and justice, Judge Morrison began. While Mr. Mitchell clearly violated the letter of certain laws, we must also consider whether he honored the spirit of justice that those laws were meant to protect. The judge acknowledged the prosecution's arguments about the importance of maintaining government secrecy and following proper procedures. He agreed that these concerns were legitimate and that society could not function if everyone felt free to ignore laws they personally disagreed with. However, he also noted that this case presented extraordinary circumstances that demanded careful consideration. Judge Morrison then surprised everyone by announcing that before rendering his final verdict, he wanted to hear directly from Thomas about his motivations and his understanding of his actions. This was an unusual procedural step, but the judge felt that the gravity of the case demanded it. He wanted to look Thomas in the eye and hear his own words about why he had chosen to risk everything. Thomas rose slowly from his seat, his military bearing evident in every movement. As he approached the witness stand one final time, the courtroom was completely silent. Everyone present understood that they were about to witness a moment that would be remembered long after the trial ended. The decorated royal guard was finally going to tell his story in his own words, and his fate would depend on whether Judge Morrison believed him. Thomas Mitchell stood at the witness stand with the same steady composure he had maintained throughout years of royal guard duty. Judge Morrison's penetrating gaze seemed to be looking into his very soul, searching for any hint of deception or self-serving motivation. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of Thomas adjusting his medal could be heard throughout the room. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "I want you to explain to this court, in your own words, why you chose to violate your oath of secrecy. I want to understand what drove you to risk your career, your freedom, and your reputation." Thomas took a deep breath before responding, his voice clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, when I joined the Royal Guard, I took an oath to protect and serve. I understood that meant protecting state secrets, but I also understood it meant protecting the people of this nation. When I discovered that corruption was stealing money meant for schools and hospitals, I realized those two duties were in conflict." The judge leaned forward slightly, clearly engaged by Thomas's direct and honest response. "Continue, Mr. Mitchell. Help me understand your thought process." Thomas's eyes never wavered from the judge's face as he continued. "Your Honor, I spent 3 months trying to find a way to expose this corruption through proper channels. I reported it to my supervisors, to internal affairs, to every official avenue I could find. Each time I was told to forget what I had seen or face consequences. I realized that the corruption reached so high that the system designed to stop it had been compromised." Judge Morrison nodded slowly, clearly weighing every word. "And what ultimately convinced you that breaking your oath was the right course of action?" "Your Honor, I kept thinking about a little girl I had met during a hospital visit with the royal family. She was 7 years old and needed surgery that the hospital couldn't afford because their budget had been cut. I later learned that the money for that surgery had been stolen by the same officials whose corruption I had discovered. I couldn't live with myself knowing that children were suffering while I stayed silent to protect my career." The emotional impact of Thomas's words was evident throughout the courtroom. Several jurors wiped their eyes, and even some government officials looked uncomfortable. Judge Morrison himself seemed deeply affected by the simple honesty of Thomas's explanation. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge continued, Did you ever consider that your actions might encourage other government employees to take similar risks, potentially leading to chaos in our institutions? Thomas paused thoughtfully before answering. Your Honor, I hope my actions encourage other government employees to have the courage to expose wrongdoing when they encounter it. But I also hope they won't face the choice I faced. I hope that official channels for reporting corruption will be strengthened so that good people don't have to choose between their oath of secrecy and their duty to protect the public. Judge Morrison then asked the question that everyone in the courtroom had been waiting for. Mr. Mitchell, knowing what you know now about the consequences you've faced, would you make the same choice again? Without hesitation, Thomas replied, Yes, Your Honor, every time. The money that was recovered because of my actions has already been returned to the programs it was stolen from. That little girl I mentioned got her surgery. Dozens of other children received medical care they needed. Schools were able to hire teachers they couldn't afford before. If protecting those people cost me my career and my freedom, that's a price I'm willing to pay. The power of Thomas's conviction was unmistakable. Here was a man who had faced the full weight of the legal system's displeasure and remained unrepentant about his choice to put public welfare above personal security. His military bearing and obvious sincerity made it impossible to doubt his motivations. Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, clearly moved by what he had heard. Mr. Mitchell, you may return to your seat. I need a few moments to consider my decision. As Thomas walked back to the defendant's table, the courtroom remained silent. Everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. A man of unshakable principle explaining why he had chosen conscience over career, public service over personal security. The judge's pause stretched for several long minutes as he wrestled with the competing demands of legal precedent and moral justice. Finally, he straightened in his chair and began to speak, his words carrying the full authority of his office. In my 30 years on this bench, I have rarely encountered a case that so clearly pits the letter of the law against the spirit of justice. Mr. Mitchell has admitted to violating his oath and breaking federal statutes. Under normal circumstances, this would result in conviction and significant penalties. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Morrison continued. However, these are not normal circumstances. The evidence shows that Mr. Mitchell exhausted all proper channels before taking his drastic action. The corruption he exposed was real, extensive, and harmful to the public welfare. His motivations were pure, and his actions resulted in enormous public benefit. Thomas maintained his military posture, accepting whatever judgment was about to be rendered. His lawyer, Sarah Chen, gripped her pen tightly, knowing that the next few words would determine her client's fate. Judge Morrison's voice grew stronger as he prepared to deliver his verdict. The law must be respected, but justice must also be served. In this case, I find that justice requires acknowledging the difference between criminal behavior, motivated by greed or malice, and principled action, motivated by a desire to protect the public welfare. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone waited for the judge's final decision. Thomas's medal caught the light one more time, a symbol of honor that was about to be either vindicated or forever tarnished by the court's judgment. Judge Morrison's voice filled the silent courtroom as he continued his historic verdict. The court finds that while Mr. Mitchell technically violated certain statutes, his actions were justified by extraordinary circumstances and motivated by the highest principles of public service. Therefore, this court finds the defendant not guilty of all charges. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps, applause, and heated whispers. Thomas remained perfectly still, maintaining his military composure even as relief washed over him. Sarah Chen closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of their victory. The prosecutor, Richard Hawthorne, sat stunned, clearly unprepared for this outcome. But Judge Morrison was not finished. He raised his hand for silence and continued speaking, his words carrying even greater weight than before. However, I want to address something that has deeply troubled me throughout these proceedings. Mr. Mitchell, would you please stand? Thomas rose immediately, unsure what was coming next, but ready to face whatever additional judgment the court might render. The room fell silent again as Judge Morrison's expression grew stern, almost angry. Mr. Mitchell, I have learned during this trial about the extraordinary corruption you exposed and the personal courage you demonstrated in bringing it to light. I have heard testimony about your exemplary military service, your acts of heroism, and your lifelong dedication to serving others. What troubles me is not what you did, but what others tried to do to you in response." The judge's voice grew harder as he continued. "During the recess, I received additional information about the investigation triggered by your disclosures. It appears that certain government officials attempted to have your military medals and honors revoked as punishment for your whistleblowing. They wanted to strip you of the recognition you earned through genuine heroism in an effort to destroy your reputation and discourage others from following your example." Thomas's eyes widened slightly. This was the first he had heard of such attempts. The medal on his chest suddenly felt even more significant, representing not just his past service but his right to be recognized for it. Judge Morrison's anger was now clearly visible. Such vindictive behavior by government officials represents a far greater threat to our institutions than anything Mr. Mitchell did. Attempting to rewrite military records and revoke earned honors as punishment for exposing corruption is itself corrupt behavior of the worst kind. The judge then did something unprecedented in his long career. He stepped down from the bench and approached Thomas directly, looking him in the eye with unmistakable respect. "Mr. Mitchell, not only does this court find you innocent of all charges, but I want to personally recognize the courage you displayed in choosing justice over personal security." What happened next shocked everyone present. Judge Morrison, a man known for his strict adherence to protocol and judicial propriety, reached out and straightened Thomas's medal with careful reverence. "This medal represents genuine heroism, and no corrupt official has the right to take it from you. You earned it through your actions in Afghanistan, and you have honored it through your actions here at home." The symbolism of the moment was lost on no one. Here was a federal judge, the embodiment of legal authority, personally affirming the honor of a man who had been branded a traitor by his own government. The gesture spoke louder than any words about the true nature of justice and the proper relationship between law and morality. As Judge Morrison returned to the bench, he delivered his final remarks to the packed courtroom. "Let this case serve as a reminder that our legal system exists to serve justice, not to protect the powerful from accountability. Mr. Mitchell's actions remind us that sometimes the greatest patriotism requires the greatest personal sacrifice." The judge then addressed the broader implications of the case. "To any government employee who might face a similar situation in the future, know that this court will always consider the motivations behind your actions and the public benefit that results from them. Conscience and justice must never be subordinated to bureaucratic convenience or institutional protection." Thomas stood throughout these remarks with tears visible in his eyes for the first time during the entire proceedings. The weight of months of uncertainty, public scrutiny, and potential imprisonment was finally lifting from his shoulders. More importantly, his actions had been validated by the highest legal authority, confirming that he had indeed chosen correctly when faced with an impossible decision. As the judge prepared to adjourn the court, he made one final statement that would be quoted in newspapers and law schools for years to come. "True heroism is not just about physical courage in the face of enemy fire. Sometimes it requires moral courage in the face of institutional pressure. Mr. Mitchell has demonstrated both forms of heroism, and our nation is better for his service." The gavel came down with finality, officially ending the case that had captivated the nation and set a new precedent for how whistleblowers would be treated by the courts. Thomas Mitchell, the royal guard who had risked everything to expose corruption, was vindicated not just legally but morally. As people began to file out of the courtroom, many stopped to shake Thomas's hand or offer words of support. Fellow veterans saluted him with obvious pride. Even some government officials who had initially opposed him now approached with grudging respect for his principles and the judge's powerful endorsement of his actions. The medal on Thomas's chest had become more than a symbol of past heroism. It now represented the ongoing duty of all citizens to choose justice over convenience, truth over comfort, and public service over personal security. His ordeal was over, but his real legacy was just beginning. 6 months after the trial that changed everything, Thomas Mitchell stood once again in military dress uniform. But this time the circumstances were entirely different. He was at the National Veterans Memorial, speaking to a gathering of active duty soldiers, government employees, and citizens who had come to hear from the man who had become a symbol of moral courage in the face of institutional pressure. The aftermath of his legal victory had brought unexpected developments. The investigation triggered by Thomas's disclosures had continued to expand, ultimately uncovering a corruption network that reached far higher than anyone had initially suspected. Over 20 government officials were eventually prosecuted, and more than $80 million in stolen public funds was recovered and returned to essential services. Thomas had been offered reinstatement to his position as a royal guard with full honors and back pay, but he had respectfully declined. The experience had shown him that his true calling lay in advocating for government transparency and supporting other whistleblowers who found themselves in similar situations. He established a foundation to provide legal and financial assistance to government employees who risked their careers to expose wrongdoing. The legal precedent set by Judge Morrison's decision had already been cited in several subsequent cases, providing protection for other principled individuals who chose conscience over compliance. Law schools began teaching the case as an example of how courts could balance competing legal and moral obligations. The Mitchell Standard became shorthand for evaluating whether whistleblowing actions were justified by extraordinary circumstances and pure motivations. Thomas's story had attracted international attention, with foreign journalists and government officials studying how his case was handled as a model for protecting those who expose corruption. Several countries revised their whistleblower protection laws based on the principles established in his trial. His actions had sparked a global conversation about the proper relationship between institutional loyalty and public service. The medal that had nearly been stripped from him by vindictive officials now carried even greater significance. It had been featured in museum exhibits about military honor and moral courage. Military academies used his story to teach cadets about the complex ethical challenges they might face in their careers. The simple piece of metal had become a powerful symbol of the principle that true honor sometimes requires difficult choices. In his speech at the memorial, Thomas addressed the young soldiers and government employees in the audience directly. "I want you to understand that what I did was not heroic in any traditional sense. I was terrified throughout the entire process. I lost sleep, questioned my decisions constantly, and feared for my future every single day. But I learned that courage is not the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite being afraid." He spoke about the importance of having strong institutions, but also about the need for individuals within those institutions to maintain their moral compass. "Loyalty to your country and loyalty to your conscience should never be in conflict," he explained. "But when they are, remember that your ultimate loyalty must be to the people you serve, not to the officials who happen to be in power at any given moment." Thomas shared details about the children whose medical care had been restored because of the recovered funds, the schools that were able to hire desperately needed teachers, and the community programs that were saved from closure. These real-world impacts gave meaning to all the legal arguments and constitutional principles that had been debated during his trial. The audience was particularly moved when Thomas introduced Sarah Chen, the lawyer who had defended him, and Judge Morrison, who had made a surprise appearance at the memorial. The judge, now retired, spoke briefly about the responsibility of the legal system to protect those who protect others. Mr. Mitchell reminded all of us that justice is not just about following rules, it's about ensuring that rules serve their proper purpose of protecting society. Perhaps the most powerful moment came when Thomas was approached by a young government accountant named Maria Santos. She had been struggling with her own discovery of financial irregularities in her department and had been inspired by Thomas's story to come forward. With his foundation's support, she had successfully exposed a scheme that was defrauding veterans' benefits programs, leading to the prosecution of several officials and the protection of thousands of veterans' rightful benefits. "Your example gave me the courage to do what I knew was right," Maria told Thomas in front of the gathered crowd. "Because of you, I knew that standing up for what's right was more important than keeping my job." Her words illustrated how Thomas's individual act of courage had created a ripple effect, inspiring others to choose principle over personal security. The memorial event concluded with Thomas receiving an unexpected honor. Veterans organizations from across the country had collaborated to create a new award, the Medal of Moral Courage, specifically to recognize individuals who risked their careers and personal welfare to protect the public interest. Thomas was the first recipient, but the award would be given annually to others who demonstrated similar principled action. As the ceremony ended and people began to disperse, Thomas stood quietly for a moment, looking at the names engraved on the memorial wall. These were men and women who had given their lives in service to their country. He understood that his sacrifice was different but part of the same tradition of putting duty before self-interest. The medal on his chest, the same one that had nearly been stripped away by vengeful officials, caught the late afternoon sun one final time. It no longer represented just his military service in Afghanistan, but had become a symbol of a different kind of courage. The courage to stand alone when necessary, to face institutional pressure without yielding, and to trust that truth and justice would ultimately prevail. Thomas Mitchell returned home that evening to his modest apartment, where he continued his quiet life of service. His victory in court had made him famous, but he remained the same humble man who had always put others first. The only difference was that now he knew, with absolute certainty, that he had made the right choice when faced with the most difficult decision of his life. The royal guard who had been ordered to remove his medal had not only kept it but had proven that true honor cannot be taken away by those who would abuse their power. His story became a reminder that in a world where corruption and compromise seem commonplace, individual courage and moral clarity can still change everything. The medal he wore represented not just personal achievement, but the enduring power of conscience over convenience, principle over pragmatism, and justice over institutional self-interest.